Greetings again, folks. I've just learned we're preparing to tape this last session now, which will be week number 4. But I've just learned for week number 3, I went way over time, and I apologize for that. We'll try to be a little more realistic in our timing this time around. One of the things that we can cut out, obviously, is the reading of chapter 3, since I read it last time. We're just recognizing how pathetic your teacher is, and we'll trust that everybody understands that and realizes that we're up against it. So, we come to chapter 3, and because I read it, I'm not going to continue to read it. I did note, as we gathered together last time, that I read the words Selah. That is, most of us have probably heard over the years, it's a somewhat unknown, but a musical term that is used in many of the Psalms. Chapter 3 begins with this prayer, and Habakkuk describes it as a prayer. There are some theologians who say it really isn't a prayer, it's more of a psalm. Well, it has elements of psalms to it, yes indeed, and some have suggested that perhaps it was used as a psalm in early Israelite worship, and that's entirely possible. But I prefer to go with what Habakkuk says, and Habakkuk says it's a prayer. I've often thought book reviewers, they will say, I remember in school looking at some of the plays of Shakespeare, and part of our responsibility was to go through and determine what Shakespeare meant and what he was trying to say. And I remember saying to my teacher one time, has anybody ever asked Shakespeare what he meant? And sometimes I feel that way with some book reviews and article reviews. Did anyone ever ask the author what he meant, rather than simply saying, this is obviously what he meant? And so here, Habakkuk is providing a psalm, yes, and it can be used as a psalm, but Habakkuk, the author, under the inspiration of God, says it's a prayer. And he prayed. Now, I read one commentator who said, well, the only prayer in this whole thing is in verse 2. And in verse 2, he says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day. But I would suggest to you again that the entire chapter is a prayer. We have this incredible privilege of speaking with the living God, and Habakkuk speaks with God, and he speaks about God in his speaking with him. And so, as a result of everything that has come before, Habakkuk now utters this prayer before God. And it is just an absolutely marvelous way to conclude this book. Habakkuk has said to God, how long are you going to put up with everything that's going on around us here in Judah? Your people have ignored you. They have wandered away from you. They are evil. They are engaged in wicked oppression and all kinds of destructive violence. And how long are you going to tolerate this? God responds and says, I am not. I am going to send the Babylonians to punish my people. Habakkuk responds to God, why them? How in the world can you possibly, you who are righteous and the Holy One, you cannot look upon evil, you cannot abide sin. How can you use such sinful people to bring righteous judgment to your own people? God responds, they will be punished as well. I am using them as instruments in my hand, but woe unto them and woe unto any who would do such things, as we saw last week in chapter 2. And so here, Habakkuk is describing his response and reaction to all of this with this triumphant prayer of faith that comes at the end of this book. And so it begins with this interesting statement, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, and then this on Shigionoth. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want us to understand that that is an untranslatable Hebrew word. The fact of the matter is, nobody really knows what it means. And that's why when I read the passage mistakenly last week, we looked at this Selah, this phrase that is a musical term, again, not entirely clear, but most scholars recognize that it's some kind of addition to the text that is a note to the musician regarding how it is to be sung or played as a song. Well, most scholars believe that this word is the same kind of thing, that it would be very similar to our andante or moderato, some kind of an expression of intent for the use of this music in temple worship. These are some of the reasons that people have suggested that, in fact, Habakkuk was a musical priest in the temple, and one of those from 1 Chronicles chapter 25, verse 1. This reviews for us, as Habakkuk lays out this prayer, the fact that Habakkuk understands and acknowledges the grandeur and the glory of God. And so he says as he begins this prayer, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. I would like us, as we begin, to note a significant progression between verse 2 in chapter 3 and verse 19 in chapter 3. He begins in verse 2, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. If you go all the way through the prayer then to verse 19, there he says, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. And I simply would suggest that progression is from I've heard of your fame, I stand in awe of your deeds, to I know the sovereign Lord. And that's a wonderful progression of faith and confidence and trust that I believe is laid out there for us purposely by God through this prophet Habakkuk. And so we begin in this passage, and because I've already read it, we won't take the time to do that. But in verses 1 through 15, Habakkuk describes for us an appearance of God in physical form. That's called a theophany. Scholars are somewhat disagreeing as to whether or not there's one or two theophanies here. Some have said he begins by describing God's experience with his people in the exodus from Egypt. And that's one of the theophanies. And the ancient mountains crumbled, the age-old hills collapsed, all of these marvelous things that went, particularly in Sinai, all of the kinds of things that occurred. And then some suggest that he moves to a second theophany involving the waters and the sea. That may be. I wouldn't pretend to be a scholar who would argue with scholars on this issue, but I would simply suggest from my own perspective that it's just one theophany. And the raging waters still fits that theophany of God's appearance before his people at Sinai, and the parting of the waters as the people were led from Egypt and toward the promised land. Whether it's one or two, God does appear, and God appears in these marvelous theophanies. Habakkuk was called to understand exactly who God was and who he is, and to submit to all of his daily troubles, whatever they were, whatever their nature, he was to submit them to him. Job had the same kind of answer after he too had questioned what God was doing in his own life, and in a sense challenged God's goodness and power. And God responds by saying, basically, who are you? I am the creator. I am the one who made you, and my will and my purpose and my plan are to be followed. And so Habakkuk here recognizes these wondrous theophanies. He expresses God's personality and God's nature and God's character in language and in literary forms that are pretty typical of the Psalms. And that has led many to believe that this is more of a psalm than it is a prayer. Well, prayers can be psalms and psalms can be prayers. And so I think that's kind of linguistic nitpicking, if you will, as to whether it's a prayer or a psalm. It is a prayer in psalmic form. And many believe that perhaps this psalm, this prayer of Habakkuk, became used as a psalm in later Israelite worship. Back to verse 2 for just a moment. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. O Lord, renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk knew that God had intervened on behalf of Israel in the past. And basically what he's saying here is, do it again, Lord. I know what you've done in the past. I'm aware of that. I'm conscious of that. I rejoice in that. I stand in awe of what you did in those days. And I'm simply asking you to do it again. Bring that kind of power. Bring that kind of intervention into the life of Judah at this particular time and at this particular point. Note that he asks God, and I believe that this is significant. I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. And then he says, renew them in our day. And I'm suggesting to you that that's an important word. Habakkuk doesn't say, restart them. Start all over again with your people. No, renew them. Your power, your deeds, your intervening in the lives of people, in the lives particularly of your people, is an ongoing thing. It has always been there. You have always been there. And so I'm asking you to renew those deeds, to renew that power, to renew those activities in the lives of your people. Bring them again. Keep alive your work. In essence, that's what Habakkuk is saying. Not start all over again. We've missed you, we've lost you somewhere along the line, and we need you to reboot. No, but keep alive what has always been there. Keep alive your character and your nature and your intervening power in our lives. And in your wrath, recognizing that we rightly deserve that wrath, and your people deserve that judgment, in that wrath, oh Lord, remember mercy. What a wonderful prayer. What a wonderful way to come before God and to recognize, yes, Lord, I deserve your judgment. But in that judgment, in your wrath, remember mercy. For you are a merciful God, a loving and gracious, mighty and powerful, righteous and holy God, yes. In that righteousness, in that holiness, in that utter perfection, remember mercy for your people. And Habakkuk provides that wonderful, wonderful introduction to this prayer. And so he says, in essence, do it again, Lord. Remember your mercy. Then Habakkuk, beginning in this particular passage, says, he rehearses that God came from Teman. This theophany, which is set in the desert and in the wilderness of the desert, portrays God's appearance at Mount Sinai. God burst forth as a flashing light that filled the entire earth, verses 3 and 4. Some take this to be a lightning storm and compare it with Exodus chapter 19, verse 16. But perhaps based on a similar theophany that is found in Deuteronomy 33:2, it could perhaps be better understood as a brilliant sunrise over the mountains of Teman. Habakkuk then also pictures God as a mighty king who's accompanied by this entourage, this retinue that included pestilence and plague. His agents to wreak havoc on the earth, verse 5 in chapter 3. When God comes, it's as if the eternal mountains, including the granite mountain of Sinai, are scattered, and the tents then of the desert dwellers in Cushan and in Midian tremble on the unstable ground. There's this picture of upheaval, this picture of the whole earth trembling before the very presence of God and under the mighty power of his hand. When God appears, nothing is the same. When God appears, nothing looks the same. When God appears in this physical presence, when we experience, and I have not, but when we experience a theophany, the very presence of God I've suggested to us before, we will not stand up and cheer. I don't think so. I think we will fall prostrate on our faces before the almost unbearable presence of God. And that, in essence, is what Habakkuk is describing here. There is this upheaval of all of creation and nature surrounding the people of God when he appears in this somewhat physical form. That theophany then appears, whether it's the second one or the second half of the first one, it also is set in verses 8 through 15 over the sea and its coastlands. And the language is, again, that of a powerful storm, churning up the deep and terrorizing anything that might try to venture upon the sea. God appears in this theophany as a mighty warrior with horse and chariot in verses 8 and in verse 15. In verses 9 and 11, he has arrows and a spear. He defeated the enemy in the midst of raging waters, much as he had brought salvation to his own people, Israel, when Moses parted the Red Sea. And so this theophany, or these theophanies, in the first 15 verses, describe for us the incredible, powerful nature of God, and answer Habakkuk's proper questions and prior questions as to why God allowed evil, or appeared at least to allow evil, to go unchecked. God's answer was not particularly specific for Habakkuk, but it was unassailable. Habakkuk was called to understand exactly who God was and is, and to submit his daily troubles, whatever they are, into God's hands. And so Habakkuk has this quiet confidence and assurance in God, and seeks that God would thoroughly renew his mighty deeds in the lives of his people. So in verses 16 through 19, having described here the massive power and the manifestation of that power through these raging seas and horses and chariots and uncovered bows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath you strode through the earth. In anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. All of this marvelous description of the destructive power of God's movement in the lives of people and of nations. Pharaoh is pictured here as having been stripped and crushed by the Almighty God. He sought to persecute and destroy and crush under his own power the people of God, and God released them from that hold that Pharaoh had on them, and in fact turned all of that power upon Pharaoh. And so as that occurred, and as Habakkuk is describing this for us, he uses this theophany of God's appearance in leading his people out of Egypt through Moses, and says this is what is going to happen to Babylon. This will be just as true, and it is a marvelous and wonderful thing that God is doing. And he expresses his gratitude and his praise before God, but he also expresses then that quiet confidence before God. Like Job, Habakkuk had responded the only way he could, in submission, quiet submission and trust. His insides trembled. Did you see that as we read through this in verse 16? I heard, and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity. This whole idea of God appearing before his people, we almost tend to have this picture, as I've perhaps suggested before, of God as something of a benign heavenly grandfather who sits in his divine rocking chair and looks out over the battlements of heaven, and tisk tisk, boys will be boys, and how people will be people. No, when God appears before people, the very mountains tremble, the raging sea, the insides of Habakkuk trembles. He is not the same, and none of us are ever the same in the presence of the Almighty God. And so he expresses this marvelous truth that he's remembering. I know this. I recall your fame. I recall and stand in awe of your deeds. I'm aware of what happened. I'm aware of what you did with your people and all that surrounded that, and all of the terror that so often surrounded that. And so at the prospect of having to endure the invasion of the Babylonians, Habakkuk says all he can do is wait, accept God's will for his people, and wait for that divine wrath to pass. And yet he says, in that wrath, remember mercy. He ends his book in a marvelous and wonderful way with probably one of the strongest statements of confidence found in the entire Bible. Notice that Habakkuk responds to difficult times in a number of ways before we get to that marvelous prayer. In chapter 1, Habakkuk had asked, "How long, O God? How long are you going to tolerate the evil, destructiveness, and violence of your own people?" And God responds, "Not long. I'm going to send the Babylonians, and they will destroy that nation. They will bring my judgment upon my people." And Habakkuk says, "But why then? Why, as the holy and righteous one, why would you tolerate these evil, wretched, horrible people bringing judgment upon your people?" And God, as we saw in the last session, responds, "I am going to bring judgment upon them as well. They will face the same kind of judgment that they will, and worse, that they will be bringing to my people." So God says, or Habakkuk says to God, "Why the Babylonians?" God says they too will be punished. Habakkuk responds then in the only way that he possibly can here in chapter 3. And I believe it's significant for us to note, this is the way that any of us, all of us, individually, corporately, should respond to difficult times. And we all have them, and we're in the midst of them in so many ways in our own lives now. And we recognize that, understand that. How do we respond to God? And I would suggest to you that we do so as Habakkuk did. Number one, relate to God. That's what he did in the very first chapter. He prayed. All of this trouble is surrounding him, all that is going on. What does he do? The very right thing. He responds by relating to God, by coming to God in prayer and asking of him, "What are you doing? What is your will?" And so he says, "Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. And I'm simply asking that you renew those deeds. Renew them in our day, in our time. Make your deeds known. Make your power known. Make your presence known. And in wrath, remember mercy." It's a wonderful prayer of confession. It's a wonderful prayer of adoration. It's a wonderful prayer of coming before God, acknowledging who he is, and asking of him that he continue in his work with his people to renew, to keep alive the great faith and deeds and marvelous majesty that is such a part of God. And so, how do we deal with difficult times? First of all, relate to God. Come to him in prayer. Secondly, recognize our own weakness. I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. And then all the way over in verse 16, I heard, my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones. My legs tremble. All of this manifestation of your great power, and then your statement that you are going to unleash that power upon your people. It caused the insides, my own insides, to tremble. And so he says to God, I understand that I'm nothing before you. I recognize my weakness. I know how desperately I need you. And I suggest that that's what we do. Relate to God. Recognize our own weakness. Review, then, the greatness of God. And that's what Habakkuk does in verses 3 through 15. I've heard of your fame. I know your deeds. And by the way, here are some of them. Here's what I remember. God appeared from Teman. God appeared before his people in that Sinai Peninsula, in that desert experience. And the mountains trembled, the mountains collapsed, the seas raged and roared. You flashed your power from your hand. It was an incredible and an amazing experience. The glory of the Lord shone. The glory of the Lord caused terror on the part of those who experienced and saw it. And I remember, and I know that, and I recognize that, and I am simply reviewing before you the greatness of the mighty God. Then he says, reaffirm faith in God. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails. Habakkuk is talking here about the whole nature of Israelite industry at this point, all of the source of income. If none of that ever happens again, the fields produce no food, no sheep in the pen, no cattle in the stalls. If we have nothing, and you choose to bring utter devastation upon us, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. Is there a difference between this statement and his opening statement? How long are you going to do this, Lord? How long are you going to put up with this? Oh, not long. I'm going to send the Babylonians. What? Them? You can't possibly be serious. You can't mean that that's what you're going to do. But if you are, if that's your choice, I will assume my place in my watchtower. I will wait and I will see what you will do. And then this expression of incredible faith here at this point. Though my insides quivered and trembled, though I was almost literally turned inside out, if you will, I will wait. I will watch. I will see what you are going to do. And if there are no figs and no grapes and no sheep and no cattle and no food produced in the fields, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. Can I just say, and I believe we've seen this throughout this study, he always has been for Habakkuk. There's always been that expression of faith, as we've already considered. I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand how you're doing what you're doing, but the Lord is my strength. He is the sovereign Lord. He gives me strength. He gives me courage. He gives me confidence and trust. And whatever happens, I will trust in him. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to go on the heights. This is a simple description of the deer of Israel and those mountain deer who ascend the heights on places that we cannot believe they can even find footing. It's a remarkable and marvelous demonstration of God's creative power. What Habakkuk is saying is, God will make me like that. I see these impossible places. I see these impossible heights. No food, no crops, no cattle, no sheep, no nothing. If that were to happen, and I were to gaze upon impossible, utterly impossible heights, the sovereign Lord is my strength. I rest in him. He'll make my feet like the deer that can ascend those impossible heights, and I will ascend those heights with him as well. And so how do we respond in difficult times? We relate to God. We recognize our own weakness. We review the greatness of God. We reaffirm our faith in God, and we rest entirely and utterly in His strength. Like Job, Habakkuk responds in faith, in confidence and assurance. And so he ends his prayer with this remarkable, one of the strongest statements of confidence in the entire Bible. Centuries before, Moses had warned Israel what would happen if God withheld His blessing from their land. Crops would fail, livestock would be barren, the land would become as unproductive as the desert. In that context, that's where those theophanies have come, or that theophany in this particular chapter. The 4 places that Habakkuk mentions in verses 3 and 7, all are in the wilderness through which Moses led the people of Israel on their journey from Egypt to Canaan. Teman was a desert oasis in mountainous Edom, southeast of Judah. Mount Paran may be another name for Mount Sinai, locating it within that great wilderness of Paran, a rugged and desolate area east of Sinai. Cushan is connected in Habakkuk 3:7 with Midian, the tremendously vast mountainous desert region of the northwestern Arabian Peninsula. Moses married a woman whom the Bible referred to as both a Midianite and a Cushite in Exodus 2 and Numbers 12. Cush is most often thought of as having been in Egypt or Ethiopia, even though its exact location is unknown. All of this is recalled by Habakkuk in his reviewing of God's greatness, and that leads him to restore his faith and trust, even though I suspect that it really didn't need restoration. It was simply an expression of reaffirmation, that he's reaffirming his faith in God. And then this marvelous expression of resting in His strength. Because of Judah's sins, God's curse became reality in Habakkuk's day. Even so, Habakkuk declared that he would not only endure the trouble, but that he would rejoice in the face of it. God was both his salvation and his strength, and would allow him to triumph in the end. In the midst of whatever surrounds us, in the midst of all of the difficulties that we may face, we rest in God, because the sovereign Lord is my strength. That's a marvelous testimony, a marvelous truth. And I would simply pray that it would be our testimony and our truth and our expression of confidence and faith in God. The sovereign Lord is my strength. Let come what may. He will give me all that I need when I need it. God bless you, and thank you for this wonderful and marvelous time together.